Sometimes I don't know if I'm noticing a new trend or if something's always been there and I'm only now figuring it out because I just started paying attention. It seems like every other game this year was some kind of roguelike or roguelite or something involving a time loop. 12 minutes, returnal, death loop, lemnis gate, need I go on? Oh, I do? Okay. Dead Estate, Curse of the Dead Gods, Inscription, Phantom Abyss, Loop Hero, The Forgotten City, Skull the Hero Slayer. Yeah, there were a lot of these things, and there were a lot last year too. I feel like 2021 especially really showed us how malleable this category of game can be. Previously, we had seen some fun plays on the formula and stretching out some of the foundations, different genre mixes, different story structures, maybe even changing from a time loop to more of a space loop like Hades, though for the sake of this video, I'll still be counting those under the time loop banner. But this year, we saw these games be used to delve into character psyches, we saw them bleed into a point-and-click mystery, we saw brand new ways to structure the path through the time loops. 2021 and the tail end of 2020 was kind of when time loop games hit the mainstream in 100 different ways. And I think the next few years will dictate whether these games will explore the actual potential that these games have, or if they'll start stagnating and falling by the wayside. So today I wanted to talk about how these games manage to keep themselves fresh despite the repetition, how they can fail to do just that, how their inherent nature affects the types of stories we can be told, and whether these games, despite being high fiction, can actually create some of the most relatable storytelling in the entire industry. Listen, nobody likes doing the same things over and over. Except my wife, she loves to nag me all the time. Talk about being in a time loop, am I right? You haven't been in a relationship in 4.5 years. Shut up, that was uncalled for. Anyways, nobody likes doing the same things over and over. At least that's partially true. We both hate doing the same things on repeat and love to see and hear the same things on repeat. A song that we love or our favorite sitcoms, repetition can be boring, but it can also be welcoming, reminding us of the positive emotions that we link to the thing that we're repeating. At a base level, most time loop games or roguelikes or roguelites, or you know what, I'm just gonna start calling them TLGs. I know that doesn't encompass all of them, but just for convenience sake, we're going with TLGs. Most TLGs employ some basic mechanics to ride that line as well as possible. Going back to a run of Binding of Isaac or Spelunky or Inscription is easier than going back to any other game because A, you get a somewhat full experience in a much shorter time, and B, the repetitious nature automatically makes games like this a comfort food, although to keep them from being tedious, they make sure to push procedurally generated levels and rewards. Every run feels familiar, but you've also never really done it before, and that's pretty basic. I don't need to get too deep into that. What I do want to get into is the potential energy of a TLG. In my opinion, for a TLG to be as accessible as possible and for people to continuously go back to it, every run needs to have an exact amount of potential. Some basic science here that I'm sure most of you already know. Say you're about to drop something from a certain height, potential energy is basically how much energy can be generated by that thing before it hits the ground. Once the object is actually dropped, that potential energy is converted to kinetic energy, or how much energy the thing actually has due to its movement. The instant you let go, kinetic energy equates to 0 and everything is purely potential. As it falls, the scales tip over, and the instant before the object lands, it has the exact amount of kinetic energy as it had potential energy at the beginning. The success of a TLG is based on the potential of every run, how that potential is adjusted, and how that adjustment fits with the game's overall goals, because all of that will eventually dictate how much kinetic energy you have as a player. Most roguelites, which people will have different definitions of this, but the most accepted one is basically a roguelike, but if you had some skills or power-ups or helpful items carry over between runs, opt for having a ramping potential. You start the game with almost no hope of beating it on your first try, you're simply just not given the tools to make it all the way through. As the game continues, you're given more tools to aid your journey, and you learn more about how the game works, and eventually it's enough to beat the game. The absolute key here is to convince the player that that ramping is actually happening. If a player has been stuck on one boss for the past 10 runs, it's easy for them to believe they've hit a massive wall, and the game needs to have enough up its sleeve to let you know, hey man, your runs are getting more promising even if it doesn't seem like it. It took a lot longer for me to beat Skull's first boss than I thought it would, but it felt like I was making progress even if I died before the boss sometimes, because I kept discovering more power-ups that I now knew could pop up in future runs, and I had been slowly given characters at the beginning that gave me instant boosts that would kickstart my journey. I felt a real sense of progress no matter what. Beating the boss wasn't an if, it was a when. A failure to convey this ramping appropriately to the player, and you have a higher player count that doesn't finish your game because they feel stuck. I feel like Returnal had a bad case of this. The game was phenomenal, but it didn't balance its roguelike mechanics very well. A lot of people got stuck, didn't feel themselves getting unstuck.
What are you doing? Stop!
Basically, you felt like you were soft-locked and you abandoned the game. In fact, I just saw an article today before recording this that mentioned that Returnal was one of the least completed games of this year, giving even more credence to that argument. A moment where I feel a lot of roguelites wind up breaking themselves is after the player has beaten it for the first time and things now have to be adjusted for the game to continue being fun. All too often, there's this big sweeping change where the difficulty is way harder, you take more damage and enemies have more health and appear more frequently. It feels like somebody put tape down on your target or put a restriction on how high you can drop something from, and it just feels really unsatisfying. I know not everyone feels like this, but I had a tough time going back to dead cells after having a couple of boss cells because I just felt like the flow had been ruined. My progress was immediately halted and continued to be slowed down. Whereas I've praised Hades in the past for implementing a system that's more dynamic and allows you to take smaller steps that target specific challenges. The difficulty feels fluid and less forced, and I don't feel like I'm running headfirst into a wall just for the sake of adding challenge. I see roguelikes, games with no carryover, as having an infinite well of potential, but being blindfolded. In most cases, it's your ever-increasing knowledge of the game, the enemies, and the little decisions you can make that help you beat it. The game never really gets easier mechanically, you don't get more healing or better luck stats, you just know what to do now. Every time I started up Risk of Rain 2, I was well aware that I would probably end up feeling overpowered, just absolutely tearing into everyone with 3 regens and almost no cooldowns. Because in the last 10 runs, I had also been different levels of overpowered. Every run in Risk of Rain, I'd either die quickly because of bad luck, so it wasn't a big deal, or I'd end up with an insane amount of kinetic energy. But it still took me a while to win because I needed to learn how some boss patterns worked, or I needed to figure out just how much I should 3D print stuff, or how to balance speeding through the game to reduce time-based difficulty versus how much I should explore for items, etc. It wasn't about needing more potential, it was about knowing exactly how to use it. In contrast, while this game isn't exactly a roguelike or a roguelite, one of the games that does this poorly is 12 Minutes. I enjoyed this game somewhat, but a massive problem I had, as did tons of others, was that in certain sections you would get so confused as to what you were meant to do that the game would come to a screeching halt. That's because the game made the mistake of having multiple paths that you needed to pursue. You'd find something important and realize, okay, I gotta use this thing to do that thing. Next run, I gotta use that thing to ask about this thing. Every run would lead to the next, and then all of a sudden, you just reached the end of that path. And there was a whole other set of things you needed to do that you weren't even aware existed. So now you had to poke and prod at everything and find another starting point to find a new path that you could pursue. You'd be blindfolded and find where you have to aim, then you'd get the ability to build up your energy and knock that thing over, and then instead of carrying that momentum forward, the game would stop and say, okay, now blindly paw around for the next thing. The game felt really stop and start as a result, and as a gameplay experience, it's the perfect microcosm of why you need to have either a constantly building or a consistently high level of potential energy in order to make these things work. But you know what, we've talked enough about what's crucial about a TLG's gameplay experience. Let's talk a bit more about how these games can actually overhaul the typical story structure that we find in most video games. If we threw back to December of 2020 and took a look at some of the nominees of Best Narrative at the Game Awards, we'd find a little known game, I don't know if you've heard of it, very obscure, called Hades. Hades was praised for, among many things, its beautifully crafted story, especially for a roguelite, but if you think about it, Hades' plot is thinner than an anorexic skeleton. The whole game is built around Zagreus wanting to escape the underworld because he hates it there and he wants to find his mom, and while I won't spoil the ending, anyone who's played this game knows that what comes from that plotline is very simple and straightforward. Hades isn't a game about twists or complex narratives, its main story is pretty cut and dry. However, I agree that this game had one of 2020's best narratives because the real beauty of this story comes from the writing, the character interactions, and the tragic tales unfolding on the side. Being a roguelite, Hades can't really have a normal story structure. Major story beats being spread out evenly is next to impossible because the amount each will spread is dependent on factors like luck and the player's priorities with their upgrades, and even the choices that they made with which doors to go through in previous runs. If the game relied on expanding on the main plot at certain intervals when you reached certain areas, its pacing would be unpredictable and different from person to person. Instead, Hades early on reveals a precedent that every run you will learn something about something. While I may not learn more about the relationship between Persephone in Hades during a particular run. While I may not get closer to finding her or knowing what awaits me on the surface, there's a chance I run into Thanatos or Eurydice or Patroclus. I develop their stories and improve my relationship with them and find out more about their questline. I could meet any of the 3 Fury sisters in any run and see how they change just a little bit with every fight. I can find out how certain gods feel about others. I can interrogate Skelly for information on who sent him. And really cleverly, as a backup, the game always brings you back at the end of a run to the House of Hades, where plenty of characters are always around in case somehow you didn't find anything significant on your most recent journey. You can develop all of your relations with these characters here and learn more about them, and even catch some tail, you dirty dog Zagreus you. You're not always moving the plot forward directly because you may not be getting further and further every run, but the game makes you feel excited and invested on playing more because no matter what, you'll find something new story-wise in every single loop, and eventually that leads to satisfying conclusions. And it reminds me, and I'm gonna hate myself for this one, it reminds me of electrical circuits. 4 years of pain just hit me like a truck of iridium. I saw my life flash before my eyes. Why did I do this to myself? I'm having heart palpitations. I might explode from the inside out. I thought I was done with you. Let you crawl back into my life. Listen, as much as these things cause me pain, I do think it's a good way of explaining why the roguelike story structure is so unique and so full of a potential that we haven't begun to truly explore yet. In a circuit such as this, one of the questions you might want to ask is how much voltage is going through that resistor, and you can't actually figure that out until you reduce and loop and expand and loop again and do analysis and loop again, but on that road you find out more about the circuit than you actually initially wanted to know. The first thing you would have to do is use certain equations to combine all of these resistors and create something that would allow you to use Ohm's law to figure out the current going on. You had to create a new loop that you then had to analyze, and you wind up finding some information that you didn't have over here. You use that newfound information back in the original loop and you find a couple of things, but then you can't go forward without doing KCL or KVL. And then finally, through using that information that you got in that previous loop, you can figure out everything, including the voltage over here. It's a multi-step process that has you reanalyzing this loop over and over in different ways, sometimes not directly gaining knowledge on what this is, but getting peripheral knowledge that will eventually contribute to that. This kind of structure will always create a puzzle, and there's a unique way of solving that puzzle. Have you noticed that basically every time loop game that features a proper story has some kind of mystery, even if otherwise the story genre is far from what you would associate with mystery? I don't know immediately why Achilles and Patroclus or Orpheus and Eurydice had ended up like this, why they felt the way they did. I mean, I kinda did because I'm a Greek mythology nerd, but in the context of the story, it's vague and merely alluded to at first. We don't know why Persephone left Zagreus either. There is a mystery going on here, even though this is not a very mysterious game. Nearly every TLG gives you the skeleton, the main focus of the story immediately, and then spends the rest of the time expanding outwards so you can ultimately get full context. Stories are usually told through, and then this happened, and then this happened, but TLGs say, this is why that thing you saw 3 hours ago happened. And that structure was used multiple times this year to delve into guilt and remorsefulness and more abstract ideas that centered around the human psyche and personifying that through a time loop. It's evolved from just an interesting gameplay gimmick and a fun science fiction premise into creating an unstable world around the character, using it to convey an everlasting cycle of regret and pain. And combined with the idea of these games actually matching our own repetition in our real lives, it seems like we might find the most relatable stories in the most unlikely of places. I started this video with a little time loop sketch, and did I do that just to pretend I was more artistic than I really am? What? No, how dare you be correct about that assumption. But I also did it because I feel like TLGs have the potential to be the most relatable and cathartic means of escapism that we can see in media, and the reason for that comes from that skits. Repetition and routine and a lack of something truly new has a stranglehold on most people's lives. When was the last time you truly did something for the first time, tried a brand new activity, picked up a new hobby? Especially as we grow older, that last time becomes longer and longer ago. We wake up, do the same morning routine, go to the same job or school we've probably been going to for years, come back tired, maybe relax, watch a movie, play a game, something, go to bed, repeat. Every day is slightly different, but it's also all too often incredibly similar. And it's no secret that people get tired with that. They want adventure, they feel like they need to change paths, they go through a midlife crisis, they get bored. We're often trying to find ways to break free from the repetition. Not always, sometimes it's comfortable and stable, but every once in a while we just want to escape. And usually the best way to do that in the easiest possible way is to play a game, preferably a new one, experience a new world where you get to do new things. I find it interesting that we've gotten so many TLGs, the most that we've ever gotten, I would wager, in a time where everyone is sitting at home doing the same routine and wanting to escape more than ever. It wasn't a conscious decision to make that happen, but it did shape out that way. On one hand, I think it's kind of tough to see what you view as the endless repetition of your life in the entertainment that you love. It can be disheartening and drive the point home, but for me it's also been a nice way to show myself that I can beat the odds and make it to the other side if I put my head down and try. And I know that sounds ridiculous, trying to take away some grand lesson from a silly little game on my silly little console, but as goofy as it sounds, I've shown myself time and time again through these games that I have the resolve to meet challenges head on and push my way through them, even if those challenges aren't the most intense things I'll face in my life. I feel weirdly attached to this genre, so much so that I've been planning on making this video for over 5 months and just haven't known how to broach it because I wasn't sure how to relay that attachment. And I feel all this in a time where most of these games aren't even taking full advantage of this unique relation to real life in their storytelling. 5 years from now, will this high sci-fi genre actually mold itself around this advantage, giving us stories that can actually affect our real lives? Where characters don't go from location to location, adventure to adventure, but they stay in the same place and deal with the same problems, and our sympathies towards that are what are core to that storytelling. I don't know, but I hope so. I feel like we're at a crossroads right now where these games could either expand outwards and give us games that lie anywhere between dumb, fun, roguelike action and serious, relatable, real storytelling, or they could get way too comfortable with where they are now and become a monotonous, repetitive slog as a genre in and of itself. At the end of the day, I feel like time loop stories, against all logic or reasoning, can actually wind up being the truest reflection of our real lives and an exploration of how we can improve ourselves in reality, and I can only hope we see more of that in the future.